there's something good about scale that you don't get when you're doing startup. So Danby, if we increase margin by 2%, that's $8 million. If we decrease expense by 1%, that's $4 million. If we increase sales by 10%, that's $40 million. So I like those numbers, because what I found in the startups is I increase sales by 50%. That's $500,000.
Yeah.
It's not the same. And once you've done billions, it isn't. Things just seem a little weak. My philosophy on how I live the way almost all of my employees could live. Well, I'm eccentric. You see, everyone just says, "Oh, Jim's eccentric. He doesn't have 3 houses. He doesn't have boats. He doesn't have a jet." Because as you say, I'm driving a 5-year-old Prius, which is a great car. It's an awesome car, but it costs $20,000. And I did buy it new, so it's a brand new car. It's reliable, and I'll drive it for 10 years. It's a fine car. I actually call it my sports car because it is red.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to episode 8 of the Community Made podcast. I'm your host, Mr. Jason Gaynard. Now, you're probably like, say what? In that last episode, you said it was going to be the final episode of the season. However, 2 things. 1, I'm the type of individual that gets clarity through taking action. This podcast is a living and breathing thing that will always be evolving. And one of the ideas I had was that instead of capping off the season, I thought I would treat the seasons almost like blog categories, meaning if I do an interview a year from now and it turns out to be a great conversation about scale, I will place it at the end of this season, or season 1, the scaling season, so that you can listen. Basically, years from now, every season will be a collection of thoughts, talks, and interviews that are tied to the theme. So although we're moving to season 2 shortly, we will continue to add episodes about scaling to season 1 as time goes on. And number 2, the conversation that I'm about to share with you was slated to be released almost a year from now for a season that's going to be positioned around me having intimate conversations with entrepreneurs who, I guess you could say, have made it by most people's standard when it comes to success. Folks who've built billion-dollar businesses and have followed the path from survival to sustainability to success, and have moved from success to significance. Conversations around legacy, philanthropy, family. But when I sat down with Jim Estill, I simply could not wait a whole year to get this to you. This could be probably one of the best conversations I've had to date when it comes to applicable and actionable wisdom. I mean, I could not be happier with how this episode came out. For context, Jim Estill is a very eccentric entrepreneur, I guess you could say. He's invested in over 150 businesses, boasts 99 consecutive quarters of profit. Ladies and gentlemen, that's over 25 years of profitable business, and successfully scaled his first business, which started really from the trunk of his car, from 0 to $2 billion a year. In the last couple of years, Jim became famous for giving $1.5 million of his own money to secretly launch a resettlement program that brought 58 Syrian families to Canada and provided them with housing, language training, and employment. He coordinated the entire program and didn't even tell his own wife until it was ready to launch. In this episode, I'm joined with my great friend, Saud Juman, and the 3 of us talk about the struggle of giving up control in order to scale business, what to look for when you're considering investments, understanding your company's niche, finding your micro-competitive advantages, and why Jim does not plan to give any money to his kids. Ladies and gentlemen, enjoy this intimate conversation with Mr. Jim Estill. By the looks of it, everything is working.
Yep.
Your mic is good.
You hear me okay? All right.
Let me just pretend I know what I'm doing here. And well, that is it. Well, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Community Made podcast. I am very excited today because I am in the presence of 2 great men. The gentleman actually sitting across from me, my good friend, Mr. Saud Juman. It's the first time we actually have him on the podcast. He's playing more of a co-host role, I guess you could say, on today's show. And I actually need to do an episode with you in the future because I've known Saud for how long? 3 years?
About 3, maybe 3, 4 years.
3, 4 years.
Yeah.
And I just adore this man on so many levels. I mean, successful entrepreneur in the medical space. There's two things I love about Saud. So not only is he, well, first, he's just a voracious learner. A lifelong learner. He values mentorship immensely, more so than anybody else I know. And I value mentorship a lot as well, but it's easy when you're busy as an entrepreneur, the life kind of gets the better part of you and you start to lose focus on what's important. And I know you've always put, your mentor on a pedestal, and you always talk about him all the time and his impact on you. And so that's just on the business side, but you also get a lot of life lessons from him as well. And that's Absolutely. An area that I know you invest a lot of time and energy on. I mean, you've, even from a spirituality component and a physical component, you've been practicing martial arts for 25 some odd years.
About that.
So yeah, just an avid learner. And the other thing I love about you immensely is you're willing to sacrifice who you are for who you want to become. And, you've made some pretty big shifts. You've had some very big life moments where you've made some significant shifts, and this is almost one of them. This feels like the beginning of something big, and a lot of us tend to have these blinders on, and we don't want to look at ourselves, or we don't want to dig into the personal stuff all that much and figure out why we're here and what we want to do, and all those kind of things. And that's something you never shied away from. So I'm excited to have you here today. To my left, we have Mr. Jim Estill, and I am super excited for this because it's funny because a rule I made for this podcast was I was not going to sit down for an interview with anybody I didn't know intimately. They weren't already a very close friend. You're the exception. And the reason for that is because I'm based in Kitchener-Waterloo. Waterloo is kind of like the little tech hub of Canada, of the North on some level. It is a small entrepreneur community, and every once in a while you hear, just in conversation, who some of the movers and shakers are in the business scene locally. And I heard about you and how you built a business from basically the back of your car to $2 billion in sales and all that kind of stuff. And I'm like, oh, that's interesting. And most entrepreneurs would be absolutely enamored by that. I wasn't so much, because I know so many very successful entrepreneurs who are successful on paper, but then you get to know them and, they built their business at the expense of their relationships or their health, or, they don't have a great reputation or those kind of things. But then after that, I am a subscriber to a magazine called Toronto Life, which is my favorite magazine of all time. I don't subscribe to a lot of things, but for some reason, that magazine is one of the few I'm subscribed to, and I read every single page. And I was reading through it, and I stumbled across an article that said the man who saved 200 Syrian refugees. And it was a story about you. And I'm like, oh, this is interesting. And I started to dig through it. And then one section of that article where it made mention that you basically took $1.5 million of your own money to bring in 58 Syrian refugee families to Guelph. But you did it without telling anybody, including your wife, until you were ready to execute. And I was like, this is a pretty fascinating guy. So then in July, I did a mastermind dinner in Waterloo because it's such an intimate community, but not too many people. The tech people stay with the tech people, and manufacturing people stay with manufacturing. And it's such a vibrant community. I'm like, for me, I love being able to walk down the street and know who owns that coffee shop. I want to spend money at these local restaurants and put a face to these businesses. So I did a mastermind dinner, and I reached out to you cold, and I'm forever grateful that you took us up on that offer and you came out to the dinner. You showed up, I think, in a little red Toyota Prius when everybody else was showing up in Porsches and Mercedes and that kind of stuff. And I was like, I'm loving this guy the more I get to know him. And then at the end of the dinner, I asked one question to everybody, and that question was, if we were to meet a year from today, what are we with a bottle of champagne, what are we celebrating? And everybody talked about opening a new office or a new revenue stream or whatever the case may be. And you were the first and only person, because oddly enough, you ended up being at the end of that roster of questions. You said health. And I've just, from that point forward, I'm like, I want to get to know this guy a little more. Then I really start to dig into your story, especially for preparing for this interview. And I'm just incredibly grateful to have you here. So to set the stage, can you give us a little bit of context of your story, in essence? I know you grew up in Woodstock. You started a snow shoveling business, which actually was my first business as well when I was 12, which was a brutal business to do in Toronto, at least. And I'm assuming Woodstock. I'm assuming there's pretty long driveways in Woodstock. So give us a little bit of context. You grew up in Woodstock. How did you get into business? What did the first few years look like?
Well, I grew up in Woodstock, and I will say there's more snow in Woodstock than Toronto. Go study the snow belt, and you'll see that. But I loved doing that. But that was just a minor little thing. And I did have a painting business when I was in high school, painting houses, and I did have 20 employees working for me. So I did that. That was my first little entrepreneurial jaunt. Then I went to the University of Waterloo for systems design engineering. And when I was in my final year, I wanted to be a circuit board designer, and I needed a computer and got a better deal. I bought two, so I bought two and sold one, and then someone else needed a computer, and then someone else needed a printer, and then I needed some software, and so next thing you know, I'm buying and selling computers. So that's what started my first. It was technology products distribution company. So I was selling other people's products. I wasn't making them. I did at the time. I kept on designing some products. So we designed some stuff. And at one point, we ran out of office space. So I took the engineers and said, okay, let's split that off and put it into a separate company. And sold half of it to the engineers, and then kept the distribution business in the place. And then I grew the distribution business for 25 years, from 0 to 350 million in sales. Then I sold it to Synnex and ran Synnex from 800 million to 2 billion over a 5-year period. And I guess that's really the story. One of my things I was proud of was I had 99 consecutive quarters of profit. And so that was because I don't believe in being a business and not making a profit. So that's my story.
Well, it's funny. There's I made mention in an episode a few episodes ago. There's a saying that business without profit is like eating soup with a fork. You stay busy, but you stay hungry.
That's a great saying.
Yeah.
That's a great saying.
Yeah.
Well, and the other thing that entrepreneurs and everybody has to understand is you actually need that profit in order to grow, because there's no business in the world that doesn't require working capital, and you need to make money. That's your working capital. And then since then, the world has sort of changed. Like, oh, you're an entrepreneur. Well, go get someone else to give you the money, and then and work for a salary and own a large part of the business. I didn't do that. I didn't raise money. The only way to have money was to make a little bit of money.
Out of curiosity, because I'm still a young whippersnapper on the entrepreneur. So I've been an entrepreneur for 14 years. You've been an entrepreneur for
all my
forever,
all my adult life. I mean, it's
even in the last 14 years, like entrepreneurship now is sexy. Was it sexy back then?
No, not at all. Not at all. When I told my parents I was going into business, my father said, well, that's okay. You've got an engineering degree. When you fail, then you can get a job. And my mother cried because her father had owned a store and it had burned down during the Depression, no insurance, all that sort of thing. So she had a very bad experience with entrepreneurship. And even a couple of years after I was in business, I went home for Christmas and my mom said, so have you got a job yet? Are you getting a job? And it's sort of...
I went through the same thing. I mean, my own grandmother didn't think I had any real business until we got our first employees and an actual office space and everything else. Right? They were very, very much afraid. What do you think going from like that 20-person painting business to scaling up and exiting at 350 million and then growing Synnex from 800 million to 2 billion? If you go back, is there a recurrent theme back in those early days of that 20-person painting company that still holds true at any scale? Like, what are some of the fundamental lessons that you still kind of like go back to within yourself to say, hey, this is still a fundamental?
There's so many fundamentals in business. The other thing is I've always been in businesses where I haven't invented the invention. I'm doing something that everybody else could do. I mean,
Yes.
you want to go paint houses, you go paint houses. I mean, it's pretty easy to do. You just get a paintbrush and buy a ladder and some scaffolding, and you're in business. And same thing selling computers. I was buying and selling other people's brands of computers. So what I then over time started to focus on, I don't think I knew what I was doing back then, but try to come up with micro competitive advantages. So tiny little competitive advantages. What would they be? I mean, in the painting business, I happen to be in Woodstock. So my competitive advantages, I only did it in Woodstock, a little tiny geographic area. Another one I knew was one of my competitive advantages was politeness. So that was a really simple thing, because in Woodstock, the painters at that time were kind of pigs. They'd throw their cigarette butts on the lawn, and they just weren't, and they didn't show up on time, and they didn't, there's just a politeness. When I went into people's houses, take your shoes off, it's the simple politeness. So, and I think we're still polite in business.
So those micro competitive advantages. So
Yeah.
then at scale, at a company worth billions, what's a micro competitive advantage?
Well, the most obvious micro-competitive advantage is to go into a business that's the right size for us. So if you take Danby Appliances, we do about $400 million in sales. We can introduce a product and sell $5 million, and LG doesn't care about a $5 million market. Like, they're not going to put any resources on it. As a matter of fact, if you want to buy $5 million worth of appliances, or even $2 million or $1 million, I personally will meet with you and with all of the execs, and we can put the A team on it. Samsung's not putting the A team on because they'll send an intern. It's not so. It's the size of market. And I believe that in all businesses, you go after the right size market. Now, as I would grow, the market size I would go to was bigger and bigger. So in the computer business, one of the niches to start with was analog to digital boards. That they're boards that sense temperature and pressure and moisture and stuff like that, and give you numbers on a computer. Tiny, tiny, tiny market. And then I expanded and went into barcode, which at the time was smaller and growing. And then in the end, when I left the business, we had like 60% market share in Apple. Like, Apple's a pretty big deal. But at the time we signed Apple, Apple was going bankrupt. We had 50% market share in all toners, all inks, all brands of printers. So the competitive advantage there is you really know your toners and your inks, because you're selling so many of them. It means you likely have the weird oddball thing, and you know that this doesn't work with that, and you know your stuff, and you've got your boxes, everything set for exactly that thing. So for me, a lot of it's about niche.
Had you had the notion ever since you were young that you wanted to build a big business? Like, was that a goal, or did it just organically happen through opportunities that you leveraged and micro advantages, I guess you could say?
Well, when I went to university, I said I wanted to start a $100 million company, which I thought at that time was big. So I guess by then it
Still
had
is big.
crystallized. It's not that big, and so I guess by then it sort of crystallized when I was in university. But when I was in high school, the painting business just happened. Like, I just happened to. My dad wanted me to paint the house and showed me how to paint it, and then a neighbor said, "Oh, well, can you paint mine?" And paint mine. It was kind of like the computer thing too. I bought a computer because I needed one, but I'm too frugal, so got a better deal if I buy two of them. So I bought two and sold one, and someone else wanted one, and so that was the path I went on.
And out of curiosity, again, a lot of people can speak to going from 6 figures to 7 figures, even 7 figures to 8 figures. Again, as we talked about offline, going from 8 figures to 9 figures, 9 figures to 10 figures. There's very few people that can speak to that. What are some? I know one thing that a lot of entrepreneurs deal with, and this is probably before the 8-figure mark, is becoming the bottleneck and micromanaging. Is that something that you had to overcome, or were you always good at delegating?
No, heavens, not. No, I mean, the biggest challenge that you have is and I actually believe to scale, it's not what you start doing, it's what you stop doing. So the only way to scale is to give things up. But it's really hard for entrepreneurs to give things up, because they can do the best thing and someone else does it. They don't do it exactly their way. So you absolutely need to figure out what you're going to give up if you're going to scale a business.
And what would you identify as, like, if somebody is to go from that 7 to 8 figure mark? Again, this is a long time ago for you. But what are some of those key hires that when somebody wants to start delegating, is the first hire they make an operations or a COO type individual, or is there somebody else in the organization that they should?
Well, one of the exercises that I've done every 3 or 4 months is I do my time logs for 3 days, and I figure out how I spend my time, and then I put little likes and dislikes next to it, and I figure out the things I don't like doing, and that's my hire. Because I tend to not be good at things I don't like doing. I tend to be good at what I do like doing, and so it's not a rule of thumb, because there's someone else who is not going to have the same dislikes as I do. So if I said, for me, CFO was a key hire because I actually don't like doing finance and spreadsheets and stuff like that. But for someone else listening, they might be a spreadsheet jockey, and that might not be what their key hire is. Maybe for them it was more of a marketing person or a salesperson. My other experience I'd love to hire all A plus players and to scale the business. But my other experience was I had to have some people that were average on the team, and then you'd upgrade one at a time. So it would be over time that people would scale or not with the business. One of the long-term commonalities is frugality. So I'm a very frugal guy. And one of the things I've always done in business is HR ratios. So 1-5-15 is what I used, which is 1 highly paid person, 5 medium paid people, and 15 lower paid people. And you just can't get those ratios out of line. If you get those ratios out of line, in my experience, you don't thrive.
So wait a second. So when this is so interesting to me, because we're scaling, and you alluded to what might be coming up for me as well. And there's this notion of A players, right? So you got to source A players, and there's even philosophies like top grading, where they're trying to take organizations from 25% ish A players to 90% A players, which means 90% high paid people essentially. But you're offering a different philosophy here, where you're saying there's got to be a certain amount, a good stable of average players as well, that are sort of mid-grade paid, or? Absolutely.
I also believe if you go out to hire all A players, you're not going to hire all A players. I believe we're going to hire average people. Our job is to make them above average. We do that by systems, process, training, coaching, and mentoring. So it's all about hiring average people and then slotting them right. Slotting is also very critical, because sometimes you'll have someone who's a great salesperson but not a great manager, or a great accountant but not a great customer service person. So slotting is important. I wish you could identify clearly who are the A players. Some people mistakenly think it's the ones that are the highest paid, and that's not necessarily the case. So I think if you have the best hiring process, you're going to get average people, but you can have average people and make them above average.
That's so fascinating. And going back to your time logs, so you'll literally go back to, let's say, your calendar, or however you plan your time, and start making a mark next to your likes and dislikes.
Yeah, so what I do is I actually break the day up into 15-minute increments and say, what was I doing every 15 minutes? So that's why I only do it I do it roughly 3 times a year. I do it for 3 days, because when the days that I'm doing it, it's kind of interrupting. It's kind of not, it kind of slows you down and whatnot. If I wake up 2 hours later and I've not put X's in the boxes of what I'm doing, then I don't go back and try to recreate it, because trying to rewrite history, usually you're wrong. Okay. Usually you think, I spent 15 minutes on that. No, you spent half an hour on that, right? So, but then the other thing I do is I have like and dislike, and that determines my next hire. But I also have my high energy or low energy, and am I high productivity or low productivity? Because I can be low energy, yet highly productive, or I can be high energy. And what did I do? I did some email. It can be, and so the more I would understand, and so I got to learn my high energy times. I know when they are. It's early in the morning, and then another surge later in the day, like 6 o'clock at night. So I learned those. Those become more sacred times for me to put high energy, high creativity tasks in. And the like and dislike, you see, the other thing I do with the dislike is often I can analyze why I don't like doing something. And I can solve why I don't like doing it. So often I can. I mean, you can't always solve the why you don't like doing something. But
How long have you been doing this practice?
I've been doing this for decades, for many, many, many years. I did it. I wrote a book on time management probably 20 years ago, and that was part of my research of writing the book. I stumbled across this, and then I modified it, and that's.
How have you, like, if you timelined yourself, like if you had an outer body of experience and looked down at yourself at each decade and saw yourself, the younger self, and slowly as you move through the different revenue levels, how has your days changed in terms of when you wake, when you sleep, the mix of time with family and the work? Has it changed that much at different revenue levels?
I would say it's not the revenue levels that has changed it. It's been the other life that changes it. So, I mean, I also have 4 kids, and so different age stages. Yes. Well, my kids now, they're all grown. They don't care if I come home for dinner at 7:30 or like they have their own lives. So it was more the outside that changed my my pattern. The other thing that I've learned as I've gotten older, and I'm not that old, but I do learn as you get older, my energy level goes down. One of my competitive advantages used to be work ethic. So I had I would work very, very long hours, and I had master work ethic. But now I've determined that I can no longer ride on that because I just don't have the energy, or don't think that that's one of the things I want to be, is the highest work ethic person.
Interesting.
I was curious. I've heard this rule of thumb, and I'd love to either have you validate it or debunk it. It was basically a CEO of a company called Rakuten in India. His view, and they had something like 10,000 employees. His view was that businesses, when they reach these 3s and 10s, everything has to shift within the organization from a process perspective, a communication perspective. So when you're at 3 employees, it's very different than when you're a solo entrepreneur. And when you're at 10 employees, things have to shift. When you're at 30, they have to shift. When they're at 100, they have to shift. 300, 1,000. Do you believe there's truth to that, at least on some level, or?
So I believe there is truth to it, but I have different numbers. So one number I have is the rule of 50. So one person influences 7 people, influences 7 people. So that's how I get to the 50 number. So most companies, many companies have this real challenge getting through that 50-person barrier. But when I say 50, that's loose. It could be 40 for you. It could be 60 for you. So it depends on the person. My other experience is the entrepreneurs. There's one before that. Entrepreneurs, sometimes it's 10 people or 5 people or 20 people. And interestingly enough, the more competent someone is, the higher the number. So for some people, they don't pass it until they're 20 people. But I know 20 people companies that are one-person companies. There's a one-person company with 20 employees. And that's where you get the bottlenecking and whatnot, and the lack of scaling. The next challenge point comes at about 200 people. And the reason you hit that is 200 people is the rough number that you can maintain that many social relationships. Yeah. So if you have 200 people in your company, you need to have different floors or different geographic locations or different, you just can't have a single social fabric with 500 people. So that's another step in that. I think another number you hit is probably, and it depends, I would say 500 or 600. When you get to 500 people, it becomes difficult to know everyone's name. And so at some point, that's a difficult point.
Mm-hmm. And you talked about again the whole bottlenecking thing, and it just reminded me that there was a story you had about 20 keys. Does that ring a bell? I read.
No. So when I was, I do remember one time when I think I had maybe 15 employees, and I was driving home from work. I was dead tired, and the reason I was going home so late is that I had the only key to the office. And so at some point, this is micromanagement. At that point, I said, I won't be able to grow my business if I have the only key. So then I made keys for everybody, because and it was very symbolic, because before that, I guess I had to start trusting, and it was liberating to give everybody the keys.
Has it been a pain point for you as far as letting go? And it's still a pain point for me. I mean, it's still something I struggle with.
It was, but I really love it now. And, just letting go and trusting the folks. And really, I mean, at my company, I play more of a supporting role to just support what our A players are actually doing.
And then one thing I was curious to know, because again, you seem like from the outside, a very well-rounded, individual and entrepreneur and human being at that. There's a lot of people who can talk about the mechanics of scaling a business. What I'm interested in is really, who does somebody need to become in order to grow a large business? Like, what are some of the personal learnings that you have to, obviously letting go and trusting others so you don't micromanage. But is there anything else kind of specifically that comes to mind? I mean, the one thing you do is also you're very conscious with your time, which I think is brilliant, and not too many of us are. Being able to set time aside to look back and say, how did I allocate my time? Did this give me energy? Did it not? Actually love the hiring practice of what are things I like to do? What are things I don't like to do? Instead of following a script of how to scale a business. Like the first hire I need to make is a COO, and the second one is a CFO, and all that kind of stuff. So that give us a little bit of insight as far as I guess that personal journey. Was there some things specifically that you had to overcome besides, again, having trust in your employees and that kind of stuff in order to get out of the way and let the business scale?
Well, like I said, for me, it's all about micro competitive advantage, a lot of tiny little things. I think the biggest characteristic that I would say would be constant learning. So as soon as you stop learning, your business stops growing. You stop growing if you're not going to learn. So I would study. When I was doing 50 million in sales, I'd study people doing 100 million. When I was doing 100, look at people doing $500 million. And so I kept on trying to figure out, who am I going to become, and recognizing it is something else I'm going to become than what I am right now. So that's how, one of the things that helped me to scale. And that's where I came up with a lot of it is, what am I going to give up? And you're very kind to make the comment to say that I'm balanced. I don't think any successful person is very balanced.
Mm-hmm. I had a question going back to scaling a little bit.
Yeah, sure, yeah.
So we talk about entrepreneurship and an entrepreneur. We've used that word quite a bit today. What's the difference between an entrepreneur and a CEO? Does one eventually have to kind of cross that bridge in some way to also pick up the CEO identity? Because I find a lot of people at maybe a lower revenue level are a bit of a freewheeling entrepreneur, doing things in a certain way, and then as the corporation gets more governance and starts growing up and maturing, there might be the need to assume that CEO persona in a way. Is there any truth to that, or?
Well, I think that can be something that venture capital world and the outside world puts on us. So if you're willing to study, you can become the CEO, and that's what I did. I just studied to become the CEO, but I sit on a lot of boards. I've invested in a lot of businesses, and there's many conversations. The biggest knock people will say, "Oh yeah, they're a good entrepreneur. They started the business. Now we need to find a real CEO." And that's and my view is, and partly maybe because I was frugal, I said, "Okay, so we can't afford a CEO here, so I'm going to have to become one. What do I have to do to become a CEO?" And so I would study it.
And how did you study that? Was mentorship component of that for
so
you?
I did have multiple mentors, so that was part of it. And I have also always been a voracious reader, so I have not had a television for decades, and so I don't watch television. I read, and I'm a big believer in audiobooks, so I listen to audiobooks or podcasts while I'm in the car. And people say to me, "Well, what's your music?" Well, I don't have music. I have, as a matter of fact, my product development, they develop this product with a nice Bluetooth speaker, and they say, "Oh yeah, just connect, search for whatever." So you connect your device. Okay, so now let's play something. Oh, what do you want? Think and Grow Rich, or what are you going to play on this? Because they're thinking I'm going to have some kind of music.
Getting back to, you just mentioned audiobooks and books and stuff like that. What is one of the books that you've gifted the most?
Influence, Power of Persuasion by Cialdini is one of my
Yeah.
favorites. Marketing, I love 22 Immutable Laws of Marketing. That's one of my
favorite book of all time.
Yeah.
Favorite book of all time.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And it's so simple and fast and easy to read.
And it's timeless. There's so many principles in there that are just like you stand for something or you stand for nothing in business. Like that has been that's taken me so many places. Or one of my favorite quotes about marketing is that. I'm getting quotes mixed up. But I'll remember it in a second. I say it 1,000 times. Anyways, fantastic book.
So 22 Immutable Laws of Marketing. A lot of that talks about niche.
Yeah.
Right. So that's part of where I get all my niche idea.
That's what it was. What works in the military works in marketing, and that's the unexpected. And God, that is such a beautiful. I love it. So, anyways, my apologies. So, 22 Immutable Laws of Marketing, Cialdini's work.
Right. I happen to like. I like Malcolm Gladwell's. I find he's a good thinker, and I love the concept of tipping point and how do you tip a product and make it go mainstream. Because I've been fortunate to live through some of the history of the making of product. I was early board. I was actually a founding board member of BlackBerry before there was a BlackBerry and before they were public. And it was so to see that tip where it all of a sudden moves from nobody has one to you don't even ask a question whether you have a smartphone. You have a smartphone. It's the way it is. And with my computer industry, it was the same thing because early on. Someone introduces a scanner. Well, what's a scanner? And who like there's all kinds of products I've lived through. So I like that concept. I like Daniel Pink's Drive. And
It's a good book.
His TED Talk is a good one. But I've read so many. There's so many good books.
And you quickly alluded to being on I know you've been on and currently are on the board of many companies, but you were on the board of BlackBerry.
Yeah.
And that's obviously was a Canadian success story for quite some time. And obviously it grew to a huge scale and then lost, a lot of its market share, obviously, at least in the personal cell phone kind of arena. Do you feel, was there specific, like from a listener's perspective, is there something that they can take away from the demise of BlackBerry? I know they're still existing and they've pivoted and they're doing relatively well. But did they take their eye off the ball? Did they get cocky when they were successful? What do you think was some of the reasoning behind why they lost market share?
Well, the challenge is it's easy to throw stones from the sideline and see. I mean, to some extent, they missed the app because who needs an app? And Apple did the app. They underestimated Apple because Apple was making a game. You have to put it in perspective of the time. And you even have to look at even someone like me. I mean, I don't listen to music. Why do you want to listen to music? And then there was an arrogance that developed, and that created that arrogance made it tough in negotiations with carriers because BlackBerry is not a product that runs without a carrier. So you need to have the carrier relation. So it was a number of things. Very, very, very high growth. And high growth means some waste. And it's tough to keep under control in that high growth environment.
Yeah. Yeah. I know there's a saying that, just waste and inefficiencies kind of grow exponentially when you're moving really quick. And they grew exceptionally fast.
Exactly.
And you're most vulnerable when you're most successful, oftentimes. That's awesome. One thing I wanted to ask you about, because we kind of touched on it a little bit, is so you built your business, sold it, became the CEO of the other business, grew that to $2 billion in sales. Then you got out of that, and then you leaned more into, was it private equity and investing? You moved to New York.
Then I moved to New York for almost 5 years, and I was doing angel investing and or venture capital, depending on where the line is. But I retired, is what I said, and then I moved to New York and did the angel, and I'd done a lot of angel investing prior to in my world in tech. So in my world in tech, you travel around Communitech and places like that.
Sure.
you just ask around. I've invested in like over 150 businesses and sold more than 25 of them. So I was just continuing that, doing it in New York. Then my dad got sick, and so I moved quickly back to Guelph, and I happened to have sat on the board of Danby, and the CEO resigned, and so I said, okay, I'll fill in. And then I say, hey, I like this. And then the ownership group said, okay, now we want you to sell it. And I said, no, thanks. I'll just buy it.
Yeah. So, well, I want to talk about buying yourself out of retirement in a minute. But you made mention of this time when you've invested in all these companies.
Yeah.
And what I find fascinating is you are, I don't want to say old school business, but you understand the importance of profits. And that's the lifeblood of a business, and scaling without necessarily taking other people's money and all that kind of stuff. And obviously tech, the ethos in tech is just, to me, it reaches a point where, they're raising all this money pre-revenue and all that kind of stuff, and they never want to turn on the faucet to actually start generating revenue, because that may actually impact the value of the business, because that's when the rubber really meets the road. Do you run into a lot of frustrations being a very principle-focused kind of entrepreneur, very strong foundation of the basics, dealing with some of these newer entrepreneurs in the tech arena, where the first thing they do is, they raise money, and when they raise money, they celebrate. And to me, like, the old school mindset is, when you raise money, that's when you really need to start working. That's, be done with the celebration. That's you have debt now, in essence. So what are your thoughts on that? Is there any friction there, or do you see their viewpoint? And
I don't fully agree with what they now think of the way to do it. They think now, you're an entrepreneur, go out and find a backer and pay yourself a salary and own most of the business. So, growing within profitability is not the thing. So there's some tension there. But that said, I still managed to invest in a lot of businesses, because I tried to only invest in businesses that I saw would have something.
Got it. And what do you look for in either entrepreneurs or in the what's a bigger weighing factor on you investing in a company? Is it the entrepreneur themselves, or is it the business and the opportunity that you can potentially support them with?
Well, the entrepreneur overlays what the business is. So the entrepreneur is a go, no go. You can believe in the entrepreneur, but it's really the fundamental. Is the business more likely than not going to succeed? And then what's your evaluation of the entrepreneur? And we're talking about scaling. One of the judgments you have to try to make is, can this person scale? Or can these people scale? And that's a really tough thing to do, because by nature, you're often investing people who've never really proven that they can scale.
Yes.
But can they scale now? It's hard to say.
Yeah. Do they have the substance to...
Right, exactly.
To actually deliver on that.
Yeah, and you want entrepreneurs to be coachable, but you don't want them to be too coachable. You don't want an entrepreneur to say, well, you told me to do this and it didn't work.
Yeah.
No, they need to filter it. And so the best entrepreneurs have just enough bravado to not be completely coachable, but they're still open and listen, and it's a tightrope.
So you've invested in all these businesses, and I'm going to ask you something that within our industry, for our business, do you see anything really, really super special out there in terms of products and business? Because I'm of the opinion that there's not a whole lot of new wheels to invent, and there's nothing that special out there. And I think the key differentiators at times, that's why I kind of gravitated to the sort of the micro competitive advantages you're talking about. And I find in a lot of industries, perhaps products become commoditized, but then it's maybe the subtle little things you might do in terms of the ability to service or implement, or give some more of that high touch value that kind of differentiates businesses. But do you see truly special stuff on a consistent basis?
So clearly there is some special stuff, but I agree with you that most successful businesses will be doing stuff that other people already do. It's a matter of them having their own little niche, their own competitive advantage. But I don't think there's that much rocket science. I think the other disconnect you have is the world focuses on the unicorns. So people look at look at BlackBerry, right? It's a unicorn. But the way to make money, a lot of it is, if you hit a lot of singles, you also get a lot of people in.
Sure.
You don't just have to hit grand slams to get people in.
And how, I mean, God, I think it's almost self-explanatory. At 150 plus investments, I was going to ask, how active are you in these businesses? Are you there from a coaching mentorship perspective, or is it?
So the answer is some of them I've been very, very active in, and some of them I've been fairly passive in. So it ranges, and I also find that, and I actually encourage this, that sometimes your involvement is high where you add value, and then less for other things. So there's certain times when I happen to have been able to add good value because it was within my experience and background, and other times when you don't need me to do your accounting or whatever, right?
Do you look for? Again, at 150, I'm assuming it's a wide ranging list of industries and that kind of stuff that those companies are in.
No. So I have almost only done technology business and a few in the environment, and the very few that I've done outside of technology, I lose all my money on. So my experience going outside of my field is I don't know enough, and people don't tell me enough. So every time I try to invest outside my field, I lose money.
Got it.
So it's all been technology, and then a few in the environment as well, which is sort of technology, sort of across, right?
And as far as opportunities in the future, is there anything that investments that, like, when you get this deal flow coming your way, do they have to check certain boxes outside of being technology or potentially environmental? But outside of technology, is there something that you're looking for specifically?
So I always looked for 3 areas to be covered: the sales and marketing. How easy is it going to be to sell? How expensive is it going to be to sell? Can you sell it? And if you have a new thing, that is actually tougher to sell in some senses than saying, "Oh, we have a different brand of tea." Well, I know what tea is, therefore, this is different. I get what it is. If I said, "Here's something completely different," it doesn't sell. So sales and marketing. The second is the technology and the tech. How tough is it going to be to make? How easy is it going to be to copy? And how expensive is it going to be to support? And again, there's no right answer. So I'm good with the technology there is none, or it's very low, and it's just the execution is just the execution of the business, right through to this is total rocket science with PhDs and whatnot. Nobody can copy. So there can be any right answer. And the third thing is business, and that is, can you make money? And so those are the 3 that need to look, and then overlay the entrepreneur on those 3.
And I have a question. This is selfish. When it comes to investing, is there a specific percentage of your net worth that you allocate towards investing when it comes to, and do you split that up, like risky investments versus safer investments? Like, what does that look like?
Yeah, so totally I believe in having different pots of money. So you've got your safe investment, you've got your play money, your riskier investment.
I'm trying to sell my wife on the play money thing right now, because we're at a position where I'm like, I want to start getting more into investment stuff, and she's not a fan, but I'm like, if we just put a little bit in this account, let me just play with this money. So
well, that's exactly what you should do. Is you have a certain play money account, you have a little bit of real estate, you have a little bit of safe money, and that's exactly the way I do it. Another rule in angel investing is you probably want to have even 3 times what you're investing. So if you have $300,000, then that's one investment of $100,000.
Yeah.
And the reason is it gives you follow-on funds that you will need.
I got a couple of Saud-like questions here.
Now you're going to be selfish? Fair enough.
I'm going to be selfish. Okay. I have 3. They're not really questions. They're more themes.
Yeah.
So we're talking about scaling. We're talking about investing, right? Essentially, we're talking about money and wealth. And now I know the other side of your life that garnered a lot of publicity is some of the altruistic things that you've recently done as well. What's your paradigm, your concept of wealth? Whose wealth is it? Because for example, a mentor of mine and myself, we almost view the wealth that we're accruing and making almost not as ours, but we're almost trustees of this wealth that we have a responsibility of being of service with at times. So what is your paradigm or context or view of wealth itself?
So I actually think that many wealthy people have psychological problems, because many wealthy people feel they need more wealth. and they can only eat 3 meals a day, and you can only consume so much. So what I did is I have a number that I believe I want to have for, and it's largely security. It's always fear. And so I just want to have that. And everything, so every year my accountant does my balance sheet and says, okay, you're worth this much. Everything over that much, I donate. So it's just 100% of what I make gets donated, except, of course, what I spend. But at the end of the day, that's my belief, and that's how wealthy people should do it. Because I have friends who are billionaires and they need to make more money. And like, okay, what are you going to do? I mean, now some of them put the pedal to the metal trying to spend it all. Have another jet, have another cottage, have another boat, have another whatever. But that's not who I've chosen to be. So I'm actually a relatively non-consumer.
So you've got that ceiling to say, hey, I need X, and that's what you need, and then anything above and beyond that is
Everything above and beyond that I give away. Yeah.
Has that always been the case? Like,
I only really started that after that's only been maybe 10 years. So
you
but before
mentioned-
that, I'd be somewhat, I do some charities.
Yeah,
sure.
sure.
I was somewhat generous, but I've always been fairly generous. But I didn't have the plan that I now have, and it's very clear in my mind what that is. So it's sort of like you're saying you're stewards of wealth for the world, but I'm not. I don't look at it like that. I look at it to say, okay, I want my wealth to be at only a certain level, and I don't aspire to more. I'll give it away.
Mm-hmm. And
Go ahead.
Do you still have your selfish question?
That
was actually a great question that has broad appeal. So
I have two more. So you mentioned that you also have 4 children as I do. So one of the things, just transparently, that worries me is I've got 4 kids. They're all relatively young. So I'm in a different chapter of life than you are. They're 8 and under. And I look at them, and I grew up in a tough, scrappy part of Toronto where, Scarborough, where I had to almost invent myself. Now I look at my children, and they're growing up in more comfortable surroundings. And one thing that's on my mind is, how do I build that grit, that hustle, that hunger?
You're totally right on, and we have to be very careful of that with your children. If you make your children's life too easy, they will never stand on their own. They will never be tough enough to do it, and they won't. And so I actually don't over support my children, and I know that they have friends that think that they should have more of my money. And my view, like, people say, well, are your kids in my business? My answer's always been, well, if they want a business, they go start their own. Like, it's not their business, right? Mm-hmm. And I think that's just the way I choose to do it for me.
So do you have philosophies or systems that you've set up? Because I know there are other families that I personally know that have said, they're incredibly wealthy, but for the family, there's an education fund, let's say, that supports the children up to a certain education level. And then towards the tail end of everyone's life, there's a welfare fund to help you in your old age. But between that, you're kind of on your own. But do you have sort of guidelines like that you've deployed or employed within your family?
So I just don't believe in supporting kids. I think it's unhealthy to give them anything. So my kids make their own. The only thing I've done is help them with the house when they buy their first house. But and of course I wouldn't make them live under a bridge. Of course, to some extent, Dad is a safety net beyond what society has as a safety net. But I simply don't give my children money, and I also don't spend money on myself. So I live. Matter of fact, my philosophy on how I live the way almost all of my employees could live.
I noticed that in a video I saw of you online. Right,
Yeah.
I was looking at a video, and I should have paid attention to a bunch of stuff, but you're sitting in a cafeteria and you're eating out of the Pyrex dish you brought your lunch in from home, right?
Right.
And I thought, he's eating in the same Canadian Tire Pyrex dish that I go to work with every day with my whatever I make at home and with the rest of your employees. And I thought that little detail says a lot about who you probably are.
I choose to live a frugal lifestyle. It's not, but it's not entirely frugal. I mean, I do travel from time to time and stuff like that. But at the end of the day, I live the lifestyle that any of my employees.
So there's
could
no
live.
personal chef around here making you filet mignon every day, bringing it to you. And
No, because I don't eat meat. But
Really nice tofu steak.
yes, but I make it. So no, I live, and I could take a lot of heat from many people over that. It's just who I
Are
choose
these
to be.
your peers as far as?
Yeah, my peers and the world.
Really?
Well, I'm eccentric. See, everyone just says, "Oh, Jim's eccentric. He doesn't have 3 houses. He doesn't have boats. He doesn't have a jet." Because as you say, I'm driving a 5-year-old Prius, which is a great car.
Yeah.
It's an awesome car, but it costs $20,000.
Yeah.
And I did buy it new.
Yeah.
So it's a brand new car.
Yeah.
It's reliable, and I'll drive it for 10 years.
Yeah.
And it's a fine car. I actually call it my sports car because it is red.
so I got my last theme here.
Is it
Before
on
I find-
parenting? Because I want to dig deeper on parenting. If
Go
you don't mind.
for it. Go for it. I get back to mine.
Yeah,
because
no,
we're talking about kids.
I love your views and philosophies and on this because it's a great debate I have with a lot of friends. A lot of them were very successful. A friend of mine is a billionaire. He spends 25% of his time right now trying to figure out how to allocate his wealth for when he passes. And I'm like, that's a lot of time. Like, this is a big part of your life. And I don't think there's a right answer, I think. But I think the one thing I've learned to kind of admire about you is you kind of set an example for your children. And, I was thinking about Kevin O'Leary. He once shared that, like, he'd be in first class and he put his kids in coach and that kind of stuff. And there's a bigger kind of gap there. And he's like, one day you'll afford to make your way into first class. But how old are your kids now? They're all in like 30s or more, 20s or more?
They're all in the 30s. My youngest one's 30. Yeah.
So the beautiful thing is like a lot of us talk about this kind of stuff like, oh, I hope I don't screw up my kid by doing that or screw up my kid by doing this. So your kids have gone through that full transition in essence. Looking back, what is one of the most important things you've instilled in them? And how did you do it?
I don't think you instill anything in anybody. They learn something possibly from that. But for me, if there's anything that I hope they've gained, it's work ethic. I think all of my kids have good work ethic. And
did any of them choose to be an entrepreneur?
no, none of them are in business for themselves. My son did start a solar business, and he shut that down and now works for Siemens. So
Got it.
no, they don't. But that's the whole thing. And actually, I'm pleased in a way that they don't, because if one of them wanted to be a small entrepreneur, which there's nothing wrong with being a small entrepreneur with, one store with 3 employees, then everyone say, oh, what a loser. Look at their dad. Or what happens if he decides to, oh, great, open a chain, have 100 stores. Everyone say, well, that wasn't him, it was his dad.
Yeah.
So to some extent,
Yeah.
to have, them in different fields altogether, my daughter can be the best university professor. It's a different field. It's good. She can excel on her own.
Yeah.
I think that's a true mark of parenting success right there, because they didn't feel the need to work in the business or follow dad's footsteps necessarily.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah. Back to your question.
Identity. This is something that, if I do speak on it, sometimes I share stories about identity. I see it in the entrepreneur world a lot, where something I've stumbled on recently is a lot of entrepreneurs, what we do is we take our entrepreneur identity, and then we wrap it together with who and what we truly are. And if the business is succeeding, then almost the ego swells, because we attach our identity to the business, and because the business is wildly successful, we think that we're personally wildly successful. The inverse is also true, that I've seen a lot of entrepreneurs of recent struggling psychologically, emotionally, mentally. If the business is not doing so well, they take it almost as a personal failure. What are your thoughts on identity and entrepreneurship and commingling who you are with the business identity?
So if you're an entrepreneur, you will definitely commingle regardless. But one thing you're talking about is failure. And so I have always said, fail often, fail fast, fail cheap. And the other one is having a failure does not make you a failure. And I am successful because I have more failures than most people. I talk openly. I've had over 150 investments. I've sold 25 of those companies. I've failed in 125 of those. Yet I'm highly successful in the angel investing world. I've been very fortunate and very blessed. I think that all entrepreneurs, I mean, I even today I struggle that if I have a good month, then I have to make sure that I know that as soon as you think you've arrived, you die. And but my mood does swing to some extent with my sales, because that's who I am.
But how do you stay so grounded, though? Because, I mean, the fact that you're bringing your lunch, right, your vegetarian lunch in your Tupperware container, right, and sitting down in the cafeteria and eating it is, in some circles, very uncommon. You know that. So how do you maintain that groundedness?
Well, I think to some extent, good entrepreneurs don't care what other people think. So I of course I care what other people think, but I don't have as much of it as I don't give in to peer pressure to say I shouldn't do anything. I just I think it's also easier the older you get, the more self-study I've done, the more I am comfortable with who I am, and who I am is who I am. And I say with pride, I'm eccentric. So yeah, I bring my lunch, big deal. Like, what's the another thing that's driven me a lot is this time management thing. So another, if I went out to lunch, it would take me more time. So I just don't do it. And I'm a health guy. And if I bring my lunch, it's going to be healthier than anything I get. And it's even a time management thing. If you're like right now, it's just my wife and I. If you cook for, us plus enough to eat for lunch the next day, it's just as easy as cooking for two people. So it all ties in. And the same thing goes with, although I am a frugal guy, the stuff takes time. So I think that part of what's driven me to not have stuff is time. So I actually don't want to own another house, because another house takes time, even if I didn't do anything on it, even if I hired everybody to do things, because you have to hire someone. It takes time.
Takes
right?
time, yeah.
Yeah.
Out of curiosity, and I want to loop back on this whole identity thing, because I think it's really, it's definitely worth digging into. But on the topic of time management, has this urgency been with you forever, or has it gotten significantly more of importance? Has it gained more importance as you've gotten older?
So I think that time management was with me always, because I was running a business and I had this. For some reason, I've always had this drive to grow. So drive to grow means you're going to be pressed for time. And so I figured, what's my most important asset, or I need to know how to control, is my time. So
I would love to know, when you got into angel investing in New York, and then you were on the board for Danby, and then ended up taking the role of CEO in 2014, it was?
Yeah.
And then ended up purchasing the company. Why didn't retirement work for you? I mean, the whole notion, a lot of people, not a lot of entrepreneurs I surround myself with, but the whole notion is like you work really hard and then 65 you retire and then sip pina coladas on the beach. Was that your model? Then you achieved it and you realized that's not what you wanted? Or did you just want a break and that's why you did angel investing, but you knew you wanted to get back into something? So
I partly the reason I retired and sold my business, partly the reason I sold my business, again, it's entrepreneurial fear. I'd had a good run. But I could see, what's going to go on, and I didn't want the business to die before I sold, so I was trying to get off when I thought the getting off was good. And while I was building my business, I did a lot of angel investing, I did a lot of board work, I did a lot of mentoring, I did a lot of coaching. So I kind of like this startup, I kind of like the stuff. So my vision for myself when I retired, I'm going to do this. Coach, train, mentor, maybe some speaking, do some board work and stuff like that. And I thought that'll be my retirement job, so to speak. But then what I found when I was doing it for 5 years is I learned that I don't get as much juice from just sitting on the sideline and coaching, because it's very frustrating. Sometimes you go to a board meeting and say, oh, I think we should be doing this. And then you come back next quarter and, well, we didn't do this. And you don't really control that. You don't own the business. You don't control the business.
Sure.
So it wasn't giving me as much. The other thing I learned is I like, there's something good about scale that you don't get when you're doing startup. So Danby, if we increase margin by 2%, that's $8 million. If we decrease expense by 1%, that's $4 million. If we increase sales by 10%, that's $40 million. So I like those numbers, because what I found in the startups is I increase sales by 50%. That's $500,000.
Yeah.
It's not the same. And once you've done billions, it isn't. Things just seem a little weak.
Yeah.
If you know what I mean.
Sure,
Great,
sure.
we had a great quarter. We made $10,000. Okay, great, you made $10,000.
Yeah. And now that so what does your average day look like now?
Well, the beauty of being an entrepreneur and a CEO is there is no average. So I do sometimes have my office days where I come into the office, do some email. I tend to have a lot of meetings and a lot of phone calls, and that can be an average in office day. But I travel a third of the time, maybe even half of the time, and so then that's different things. But there is no average day.
Is there certain things that don't change in your day?
Well, if I'm in Guelph, I always work out before I come to the office, so that doesn't change, unless I actually didn't work out this morning because I wanted to be here before you guys got here
I appreciate
and whatnot. But so occasionally, but there are certain things that I do. Another thing I do daily is I get my emails down to zero. So at night, all my emails are down at zero.
And any other best practices? I mean, journaling, meditation.
So I do journal.
Walks in nature. I mean, what are some of your go-tos on a weekly basis?
Oh, okay, so one philosophy I have, I believe you should spend at least 20 minutes a day outside. One of my eccentricities is I do walking meetings. So I do walking meetings with my staff. I do walking meetings with people I meet with. And I have a trail that's close to here. I tell people deliberately what shoes you're going to wear. Can you wear appropriate shoes? And I do those year round. So some of my senior execs, they bring like winter boots, and we walk in the middle of winter too. So outdoor walking meetings is an eccentricity and a habit, and I like that. I do journal, but not all the time. And I don't probably do journaling like some people. I'm not journaling about my feelings. I tend to be journaling about my goals and how I did. What I like about journaling is when I'm journaling, I tend to live my life a little better because I don't want to write my journal tomorrow. Well, I kind of was a lump and didn't get anything done, but a few emails.
Have you ever reread your journal entries? Because
Yes,
I've been journaling a lot, and I usually don't go back and read it.
I occasionally reread my journal entries, and I recently did read a number of journal entries, actually just last weekend. And what I learned is and I knew this about myself. I have recurring themes, and if I have recurring themes that that I don't like, that I want to change, then it's time for me to change it rather than just always complain that I should be calling my mom more or whatever. I should just make the change. So that's one thing I note in my journal. So I journal. I do meditate. I'm a big believer in meditation and think that it's the way to go. But I'm not totally Zen. I'm not I'm not over the top on it. I meditate actually for 8 minutes. That's how long.
What style of meditation? I'm sure this is a hot topic that it's within our community and people ask about a lot.
So it's probably not. It's not even a style. I simply sit for 8 minutes with my eyes closed. I deep breathe, and I try to make my mind blank. And whenever I think of anything, I try to let it go. So it's just 8 minutes of awareness, deep breathing, and I do a timer on my clock, and sometimes it takes forever before it rings, and sometimes it's over before I want it to be.
How long has it been in practice for you?
Oh, not very well. That's another one I've had on and off for decades, but it's not been one that I've been very faithful to for very long.
Journaling is something that is something I need to start doing. We have a friend of ours that created a journal called the 5 Minute Journal, and they've sold hundreds of thousands of copies of it, self-published. And basically, it's a gratitude journal. But the guy who created the journal, he's an avid journaler and loves the journaling for the self-awareness piece to what you said and seeing patterns and themes. And I think it's so powerful to be able to look back on where you were a year ago or 5 years ago and like what you were struggling with and those kind of things. Because the one thing I have as an entrepreneur, I don't know if you share this as well, is I have a hard time celebrating and seeing how far I've come sometimes.
Totally.
And I think reading that in a journal would just be so powerful to see where you were 2 years ago or something like that.
Yeah, we tend to underestimate what we can accomplish or overestimate what we can accomplish in a day and underestimate what we can accomplish in a decade.
Sure.
Someone said that, and
Yeah.
that's one of my favorite
And
expressions.
the one interesting thing you said is that like you don't want to do a journal entry that's like, oh, I just sat at the office all day, like writing emails or something like that. And that is interesting. I know Joe Rogan has a saying that like be the hero of your own movie. And another friend of mine says like, if your life was a book, would you read it? So it kind of forces you to like almost take interesting opportunities or really be intentional about every single day because how you live your day is how you live your life in essence. So.
And it ties with journaling, I believe, in being grateful. So you mentioned it, but an attitude of gratitude, I think that is one of the characteristics that will get you further than anything. It's really a good characteristic.
So I have some rapid fire questions. Do you have any other?
I have one more theme and fire away.
You go with your theme, and then we'll do some rapid fire. And then
I've got and so my last thing I'm wondering. You mentioned your wife,
Yes.
and the 4 kids. Lessons learned for entrepreneurs like us coming up, scaling relatively large businesses, and trying to forget the kids for now, trying to preserve and grow and nurture relationships or a relationships with a partner. How do you do it?
So,
Because it's really difficult sometimes.
so some of the best learnings can be learned from failure. So I am on my second marriage. So I have 3 of my own children. My wife has 1 child. That's how I have 4 children. So one of my great failures was my first marriage, and my mistake was I didn't actually put relationship on my goal list. So I accomplished my goals because relationship's not something I could accomplish. It's one of those things sort of like if what gets measured gets done. Well, the mistake that people make when they say that is then they only do things that get measured. But there's certain things that are kind of tough to measure. So my suggestion would be put your spouse on your goal list. And the other thing that I always say in time management is the power of while. Now, you don't want to do everything while, but developing habits of while like one of the things I do is I go for an evening walk with my wife, and that's what's the power of while? Well, I'm getting a little bit of exercise. I'm getting a bit of fresh air, and yet I'm having focused time. And that while is also not a distracting while. It's not like we're going. I'll do my email while I spend quality time with you.
Yes.
Got it. And have you been? It seems like again you are very. You love the game of business, and it seems to me like it would almost always be on your mind. Is that a true statement,
Yes,
or are you able to like shut off?
I try to figure out how to shut off, but no, I don't shut off very easily. So one thing I do is I do always have a pen and a little book to write things in, because if I write it, then it gets it out of my mind. So it's one of my simple techniques. That just otherwise I just keep thinking. As a matter of fact, I should be sitting here. I should have my pen and paper. Because I just thought, I should do something. And now it's in the back of my mind. It shouldn't be in the back. It's waste of mind space.
Yeah. I do the same with audio recordings. I have my cell phone. Anytime I have an idea, I'll just do an audio recording.
It's key. That's why I got this all the time.
That's right. That's exactly right.
Yeah. Are you good for your theme?
Go for it.
That was a good one. I'm trying to think. I think we all struggle with this as entrepreneurs. The balance between business is something even though you can't control it, you can do a much better job controlling that than you can like the happiness of your spouse and those kind of things. So it's easy to focus the majority of your energy there. But obviously, there's a friend of mine has a saying that there's 4 reasons why most businesses fail is the 4 Ds: death, disease, divorce, and disruption. And to me, it's always, I know it's like a sweeping statement, but again, like nobody thinks that, like, if you're an unhappy marriage, that affects your business. I mean, there's no two ways about it. So it's tough. Usually it takes you to learn the hard way, the importance of that relationship, so you can actually start focusing on it. And when you do, and you do have a happy marriage and it's going well, then everything in life is way better. Yeah. So I have a few kind of rapid fire questions just based on things that we quickly scanned over, but I want to loop back, and there's no great way to kind of segue back into them. So one of them was, you talked about the importance of mentorship. And I know you mentor people currently. One of the biggest questions I get is, how do you find a mentor? So I pose that question to you, is how does one find a mentor? And then you being in the position that you're at, what do you look for in a mentee?
So I generally don't do what I call formal mentorship. Mm-hmm. So my mentors don't know that they're my mentors. Mm. And how do you find them? I just look at people that have the answer I think I need, and then I call them, email them, and politely approach them. And of course, the other thing that usually works is if I can do something that adds value to them, then people are more apt to give you some of their time, mm-hmm. which is a completely fair way of doing it, if that makes sense. Mm-hmm. Because if I help someone, then they will. That's a benefit, right?
Yeah, I think that's one of the big problems or misconceptions that a lot of people have, is that they have to have this formal mentor relationship where you check in with them every month and those kind of things. And I'm like, we live in such a beautiful time that you don't need that necessarily. If you have it, great. But if you want to learn from Cialdini, read all of his books, watch all of his YouTube talks and Q&As and all that kind of stuff. We're in a beautiful time where you can learn so much and go so deep with specific individual, anybody you want, that wasn't available 20 years ago, 50 years ago to anybody. So yeah.
So I use psychological reciprocity as well, and that is that if you give someone something, they feel generally somewhat obligated to give you something back. Mm-hmm. So Danby has we don't even manufacture. We put our label on a smoothie blender. It's an awesome smoothie blender. It's a health thing, ties to my health thing. And I would give someone a smoothie blender, and they have to meet with me after I give them that.
So what do you look? Do you have any? And I'm assuming because you don't have a formal mentor relationship. Do you have any formal mentee relationships? I mean, obviously you have the 150 investments, all that kind of stuff.
I guess I don't have any that I call my mentees, so to speak. But I know that many people would consider me to be their mentor. Mm-hmm. But and of course I have my investments and my boards and stuff like that. So
is there anything that you look for specifically in a mentee? Or somebody that you'd actually want to invest your time in, basically.
So I like to, like one of my things is I say I don't spend time doing anything I don't want to do. Mm-hmm. So the real question is, do I like the person, and are they respectful, and at the same time is it something that I like? So if I'll say, yeah, that was a fun time. Mm-hmm. I often do the walking meeting thing, which it has the advantage also, it puts a time limit, because the trail I walk is about half an hour trail, so it means you're half an hour, and that's the power of while. Like, I get a few extra steps in, get some exercise at the same time. And
well, the one thing I usually try to throw back on people is, like, would you mentor you? In the sense that, like, a lot of people, again, they look as a mentor would be their savior, but I'm like, if you have like a 1 hour meeting with a mentor, your prep should be like 4 hours minimum, right? Like, you should not only be incredibly prepared and very respectful of people's time and all that kind of stuff, but then also, I've had mentees in the past where, you give them advice and they take action on none of it, and it's just like a consistent kind of pattern. So I don't think there's a special answer to that. But again, a lot of people are seeking mentors as they seem like.
But you're totally right. Like, for me, it kind of puts me off. If, like, you can Google me, there's a lot out there. Sure. There's no reason to meet with me and not have some fundamental background, because it's pretty common knowledge. And that's the other thing is often I refer people to books. Mm-hmm. So people say, I've got this challenge. I say, here's a book. And I kind of tend to say, if next time I meet with a person, they didn't read the book, like, why did you, what they want is me to solve, put the Band-Aid on. I'm not putting the Band-Aid on. I'm telling you where you get your Band-Aid. If you really want to, you want to solve it, then here's how you do it. If you're too lazy to go get your Band-Aid, then I'm not going to be the one that's going to put it on.
Absolutely. Yeah. And that's kind of like why I like podcasting as a medium, because it's mentorship at scale on some level. I can only have one-on-one conversations, only so many from a time perspective. I'm going to try to become more like anal about my time, because it's a pain point for me right now. But that's the beautiful thing of again, these podcasts, when they go out to, 20, 50,000 listeners or 100,000 listeners, it's like speaking to a room of like 100,000 people, which is fantastic. And you obviously, you subscribe to that on some level. You've done the books and those kind of things. Is there any more of that kind of stuff on the horizon for you?
Yes, but nothing that's on the, like, I have a lifetime to do list, but I have the ones that I can work on right now. Mm-hmm. So there's nothing more I can work on right now, because I really have 2 full-time jobs plus a bunch of boards and stuff. So, I mean, I have Danby Appliances, but I do have this Syrian refugee thing, which is, 800 volunteers. It's not a small undertaking.
Yeah. And
so right now, and that was a much more of a hands-on investment than you can donate an MRI to the hospital by writing a check, and they never ask you to run the machine. They don't ask you to book all the meetings and everything. When you do the Syrian refugee thing, then you're much more hands-on on it.
Well, I had other questions. I want to be respectful of your time, but I do want to dig into the Syrian refugee thing just really quickly.
Yeah.
Because that was, again, the one thing that caught my interest, and I got sideswiped with so many, great answers and great questions to ask you. So, give us a little bit of context. Why did that speak to you? There's so many, I mean, you look everywhere. There's so many opportunities to help and donate money, and you didn't just donate money. You genuinely got involved and got your hands dirty when it came to this. Why?
So I saw a humanitarian crisis. As I told you, I'd moved from New York back to Canada to be with my father, who had terminal cancer. And one of the things he said, what you will regret in life is those people you didn't help. And so that sort of was resonating. When I was in New York, I went to an event, and a rabbi spoke who survived the Holocaust. He said one of the things that made the Holocaust worse was good people standing by and doing nothing. So it all conspired to say, okay, I should do something. What's my part? The reason it became so public is you can't anonymously do it, because success is successful settlement. It's not just getting people out of the war-torn region. It's getting people that have lives to have to build a life for themselves. So it's helped people through a hard time. So that's what Syria is. Now, I did have people say, well, why don't you help Canadians? And most of that is done anonymously, but even what's public, I mean, I have done a lot of that. If you go look at the plaque in the hospital, you go look at Call Hospice Wellington, Call Salvation Army. I mean, you kind of do that because that's who I am. And that's the other thing I found about charity and philanthropy is I keep running into the same people, because that is also what you learn, is you learn the people that give, and they tend to, the people that give to the hospital, they tend to be the same ones that give to the hospice, and same to people that give to whatever.
Now, when you brought these 58 families to Canada, you didn't just bring them to Canada, you gave them a life. In essence, you found them housing, and you worked with, developers to try to retrofit places to have them have housing and that kind of stuff. And I believe some of them, if not bulk of them, came to work for Danby and are working for Danby today. Is that correct?
So when I originally started, I did not want to have anyone work at Danby, because I was worried people say, oh, you're bringing in slave laborers for your factory. And then after I started bringing people in, I started placing them with my friends. I said, can you call this person or work there? And I found out they weren't quite job ready. So I set up a program called Ease into Canada at Danby, where we hired any Syrian refugee, the ones we sponsor, but any government-sponsored ones or other churches, for 90 days. But the Ease into Canada has a high focus around ESL. So we have ESL classes, we have English Word of the Day, English Lunch Buddies, English, because, and then you do resume writing, interview coaching, and then introduce them to where they might be better placed than Danby. So
what's the post-year story been like for some of these families? Because you've got the year of support or so.
Yeah.
And then post 1 year, that's one thing that I principally worry about the situation is how do you sort of teach somebody to fish? If you will.
Well, out of 58 families, I have 49 of them working. So 49 of them are working and making enough money they can support themselves modestly. And the year's not up for everybody, so you don't give up on everybody. So many of them, you've given them a hand they need to be independent. I have 100% placement rate on any blue-collar worker, any trade. I mean, welders do great. I mean, 100% placement rate on pharmacists who are happy to work in a pharmacy as a pharmacist assistant or store clerk while they're getting their papers. Pretty good placement rate on engineers. Anyone IT, you know that. Every business needs a web guy or a IT help desk, so 100% on those. Where I've been challenged is older people who worked in banks or actually had good placement rate on accountants, but teachers are tough to place. Lawyers are tougher to place because you're not tough enough to work in a construction job, and it's just not in your psyche to, if you go to Russia and you don't speak the language and your chances are you're going to go work in a factory. It's not what you're accustomed to, right?
Yes.
And one of the last questions I'll have is what has that done? What was the company and the company culture's reaction to it? Has it enhanced the family feel of Danby? Like I don't know. I feel like if I worked for Danby and you at the helm were doing this, and then we had these families coming in and they were working. Did the whole company rally behind the idea, or?
Absolutely. So there was two unintended consequences in this. One of the unintended consequences was there was a lot of press. So I had no idea there'd be this much press about it. And the second unintended consequences was employee engagement. And people here are very, very inspired. And although I don't understand it, people are not as inspired to sell an extra 10,000 freezers as they are to save the world. And everyone always says, how do you inspire millennials? I will tell you, the way to inspire millennials is to do the right thing and work on solving a world problem. I have truck drivers who've worked every single weekend delivering furniture on their own time, because I don't let you drive my company trucks because it's just probably insurance, but more just nervousness, whatever. and so I just have huge engagement in the staff. It's been a really positive. It pulls the team together, and it was completely unintended. But if I had it to do over again, I would almost have done it to do that, if that makes sense.
Yeah, got it. I will end on this one question. What is, and this is an interesting one to answer, what is one word that you hope people will use to describe you?
Other than eccentric. I guess congruent, real.
Love it. Well, we just took it down to the wire timing wise, but yeah, I mean, I'm an even bigger fan now. I'll become a head of your fan club, I will say. But yeah, thank you for who you are and for what you stand for and for the work that you do. I really appreciate it, and can't wait to get this out to the world.
This has been fantastic. So many learnings today.
Awesome, man.
Thank you.
Thanks, Jim.
Okay.
Ladies and gentlemen, I hope you enjoyed this episode as much as I did. The one thing that I loved about this interview, there was many, but the one thing that I love is that it reminded me of a fundamental truth that I forgot, which is when you scale your business right, you scale your resources, both financial resources and human resources, which can ultimately lead you to scaling your impact as well if you choose to. It reminds me of the saying of, those who complain that money doesn't buy you happiness are spending it in the wrong places. So Jim has built this big business, and because of that, he can easily cut a check for $1.5 million to sponsor 58 refugee families or mobilize his staff to support them with their integration into the community. And that's beautiful. And to me, again, coming back to what I said in episode 1 of this podcast, I still stand by my views on scaling and the importance of questioning the need to scale. However, I want to showcase those that have different points of views or different philosophies. And one of my personal biggest takeaways was when Jim said, there's something good about scale that you don't get when you're doing a startup. Being a $400 million a year business, if we increase margin by 2%, that's $8 million. If we decrease expenses by 1%, that's $4 million. If we increase sales by 10%, that's $40 million. I absolutely love that part. For some reason, I didn't even clue in on how the smallest shifts can make a big impact when your business is massive. Anyways, thanks to Jim for the time and for recording that episode with us. If any of you want to give him a little shout out on Twitter, he is at Jim Estill, JimEstill. And you can also ping me at any time at Jason Gaynard, JaysonGaynard, or email me directly at just the letter J, at communitymade.com. Nothing would make me happier than to hear any takeaways you had from this episode or any changes you may make because of it. For show notes and resources mentioned in this episode, visit the Community Made group. If you're not a member, ladies and gentlemen, it is free. Simply visit communitymade.com to get access. Also, a quick shout out to our reviewer of the week, my man, good friend, Mr. Mike Bursick. After the first few episodes of the podcast came out, he reached out to me several times, letting me know how impactful those first few episodes were. And his review on Facebook was, one of my favorite podcasts after only 7 episodes, refreshing, frank discussions about entrepreneurship, a podcast that isn't afraid to question some of our cherished beliefs, like the belief that scale is always good. Do yourself a favor and subscribe. So if you enjoyed this podcast, I would be forever grateful if you would spread the word by sharing it on Facebook, rating it on iTunes, leaving a review. I appreciate the love and support, and I look forward to having you on our next episode where I share a late night conversation with 2 of my closest friends, UJ Ramdas from Intelligent Change, who are this company behind the wildly popular 5-minute journal that Tim Ferriss uses and praises all the time, and Chris Plow. We were all in the Bahamas at the time of the recording. We were all vacationing together with like 16 entrepreneurial families. And in episode 9, we talk about the pros and cons of partnerships, the importance of personal awareness when it comes to those said partnerships, and the value of communicating a vision, which is something I'm totally willing to put myself out there and expose my ignorance and my blind spots sometimes. And I went into that conversation not being fully bought into the importance of setting a 3-year vision for your company and being ignorant to the power of that and the importance of it. And they changed my mind by the end of the recording. So I hope you enjoyed that episode. I'm Jason Gaynard. Thank you so much for joining me today. And I will see you on episode 9.